Just days ago, the Trump administration was set to drop bombs on Iran. Now, it's back to sanctions.
The president says the United States will impose more sanctions today, and there were already a lot. These sanctions are in retaliation for Iran shooting down an American drone the other day. Yahoo News is reporting that the U.S. authorized cyber attacks on Iran. We have not independently confirmed that, but cyber moves against Iran have been made in the past. Over the weekend, National Security Advisor John Bolton said that military action remains an option, and so did Vice President Pence. He was on CNN's State of the Union Sunday, days after President Trump abruptly called off airstrikes.
Iran should not mistake restraint for a lack of resolve. All options remain on the table. Yeah. The United States is going to defend our troops and America's interests in the region.
All right, we've got NPR White House correspondent Franco Ordonez in the studio with us this morning. So, Franco, when the president pulls back a strike on Iran, that suggests that his administration is not all in lockstep. Has that changed at all?
Depending on who you ask. Certainly, the senior administration officials I have spoken to say that they are in lockstep, that this is a united front. Certainly, there was resolve to go through with the strikes when President Trump pulled back. But as they said this is the president's decision. It's his final decision. But they are resolved to do it. And you're seeing it on Sunday with all the different cabinet members saying, look, this is not over. We are going to continue to push the envelope here.
Vice President Pence notably managed to say he supported the airstrikes when they were ordered and also supported the decision not to order the airstrikes.
So new sanctions. This is something we have seen time and time again. This is the U.S.'s favorite tool when it comes to try to influence Iran. But as Steve noted, there are already so many crushing sanctions against the Iranian economy. What more is left to be sanctioned?
Absolutely. President Trump mentioned major additional sanctions. And as you said, there are a lot that have gone up. You know, President Trump often talks about major things happening that turn out to be not as major as that we expected. That said, Secretary Pompeo also said that 80% of the Iranian economy is sanctioned. And what they want to do is kind of turn the screws a little bit more on the economy. But it is also true that some of those sanctions and some of those penalties that they've put on the Iranian economy have not been in effect for so long. When they reinstated the sanctions, that has been only about a year. They also implemented new oil penalties, trying to prevent many different countries from from buying Iranian oil. That is a significant thing. That's only been in effect since the spring, and they want to give some time for those things to take effect.
So presumably this is to try to get Iran back to the negotiating table on the nuclear deal. It is impossible, Franco, to ignore the fact that this standoff with Iran is happening just days after the president just launched the re-election campaign.
Absolutely. It has been just a few days, and that is why the president cannot not do anything. And not only are some leaders, some members of Congress, some officials saying that you cannot not do anything because it could embolden Iran to take action, to put not only U.S. interests in threat, but also some of our key allies, such as Israel. But also, Lindsey Graham pointed out that if you do not take action now, then people will know that President Trump is all talk, and with an election coming down the pipe, President Trump cannot afford to look weak.
NPR's Franco Ordonez with the latest on the situation with Iran. Franco, thanks. We appreciate it.
It's great to be here.
All right, the Trump administration is set to discuss part one of its Middle East peace plan this week in Bahrain. But how can you have peace talks if neither side of the conflict shows up?
We'll soon find out, because the Palestinians are boycotting this summit and Israeli officials were not invited. What's on the table here is a multi-billion-dollar proposal to invest in the Palestinian economy. The White House unveiled this plan over the weekend.
For more, we've got NPR's Daniel Estrin on the line from Jerusalem. Hey, Daniel.
Hi, Rachel.
So solving the crisis in the Middle East, how does the Trump administration propose to do that?
Well, it's got a Marshall Plan, is what it's calling it. $28 billion for the Palestinians and many more other billions of dollars for other countries in the region. They've got a 95-page spreadsheet of projects that the White House wants to do, like upgrading Palestinian hospitals and roads and trade. And the White House is saying this could create 1 million jobs in the Palestinian territory. So very ambitious proposal. But one thing is missing, a very big thing, and that is it does not answer the big political questions of the conflict. Will the Palestinians get to control their own borders? Will they get their own country? And Jared Kushner, who's the president's point man leading this whole effort, he was asked by Reuters, are you going to address those political issues now? And here's what he said.
When we're ready. Again, that's something we've been working on now for 2 years. It's a very extensive document, something that I do think will, again, make people look at this a little bit differently and hopefully bring people to the table to start having a discussion about how to resolve these longstanding issues. But that's a separate topic, and we'll deal with it at a later date.
What do Palestinians in particular make of that? Because they would benefit, presumably, a great deal by this kind of financial investment.
They would. And Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas gave a press conference last night. I was there. He refused to say if he even read the White House proposal. He said money is important, but a political solution is more important. The Palestinians think the U.S. just wants to throw money at them, but, not let them have what they want, which is real independence and their state. He even said, quote, "We will not be slaves or servants of Kushner." As for Israel, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, we'll keep an open mind. And he blamed the Palestinians for being the ones rejecting the U.S. proposal, although he said that while he was taking National Security Advisor John Bolton on a tour in the West Bank and making the argument that a part of the West Bank that borders Jordan should always stay in Israel's control. And so, signaling what he wants to see in the future. Mm-hmm. And John Bolton said he supported that approach. So, it's not just the Palestinians, by the way, who are criticizing this White House plan. The ambassador to Israel under George W. Bush, Daniel Kurtzner, tweeted that he would give this so-called plan a C- from an undergraduate student. The authors of this plan clearly understand nothing. The bottom line that we're hearing is, you can't address these economic questions without understanding the political questions.
But I guess I don't understand how the summit this week in Bahrain is happening at all. I mean, if the Palestinians are boycotting, Israeli officials aren't even going, right? So is this dead on arrival? If the two parties that this is all about, if they're not even showing up?
Right, it could be. I mean, the White House says they're inviting Arab countries and investors, and they want feedback for the plan and to coordinate investments. But yeah, the main parties are not going to be there.
All right, NPR's Daniel Estrin from Jerusalem this morning. Daniel, thanks.
Sure thing.
Some Republican lawmakers in Oregon are in hiding.
Or at least outside the state of Oregon. They are state senators who have fled the jurisdiction because they want to prevent a quorum that is necessary for lawmakers to do business. The Republicans are blocking a climate change bill. It would place a cap on greenhouse gas emissions and auction off pollution allowances, all part of an effort to dramatically reduce carbon emissions from Oregon by the year 2050.
Dirk Vanderhart covers Oregon politics and government for Oregon Public Broadcasting, and he joins us from Portland this morning. So, Dirk, just explain what's in this bill. What makes it so controversial that Republicans have taken this move?
Yeah, you guys laid it out pretty well. This limits greenhouse gas emissions and begins charging polluters for every ton they emit. But what Republicans are arguing is that it's going to be very detrimental to their rural districts. So they cite things like rising fuel costs or a rise just in the cost of doing business by virtue of paying for greenhouse gas emissions as things that are going to, force companies to leave, force layoffs, really create problems for these more rural places. So they have been trying to do anything they can to keep this bill from passing, and that last week resulted in the very dramatic instance of them walking off. They left Thursday and have not been back since and are being fined $500 a day.
Do we know exactly where they are?
There are a lot of rumors flying around. Montana is often mentioned, Idaho. Some say they might be in Washington. No one seems to know for sure. Idaho seems to be the leading theory for folks, but who knows? They might be moving around.
So another rumor circulating is that militia groups have become involved. I mean, can you either clarify that, dismiss the rumor? What do we know?
We don't know much. Militia members have been very vocal online, as they often are, and they talk about, vowing to assist these senators should the state police come for them. Some have even claimed, in Idaho that they have been helping them. But when you talk to the senators about this, those that will answer your calls, they say that's not happening. They say they haven't been chatting with the militias at all. Nonetheless, though, concern over this militia involvement led the Capitol to close on Saturday, and that's because state police police here told Democratic leadership that there was a credible threat, quote unquote, credible threat. Details on that have not been disclosed. And we should say that demonstrations did take place at the Capitol over the weekend. They were mild, they were relatively small, everything was peaceful.
So Oregon's legislative session ends at the end of the week.
Right.
So how's this going to play out? I mean, could the Republican legislators just run out the clock here?
They can run out the clock in this current legislative session, but that does not mean they're ultimately going to be able to stop this. The governor here, Kate Brown, has already begun taking steps to call a special session of the legislature on July 2. So that would mean, budget bills and policy bills that have not passed would essentially have to be reset, and they would have to start pushing them through afresh. We should note, though, that there's nothing that says Republicans will show up to that special session either. So the sides are going to have to come to an agreement here. And right now, that seems pretty hard to find.
How's the public watching all this? I mean, are people tracking this closely?
Very closely. And there is even a hashtag, the Oregon 11, that is cheering these senators on from afar, calling them heroes.
Politics reporter Dirk Vanderhart with Oregon Public Broadcasting. Thanks so much. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
President Trump has put new sanctions on Iran, and Iran is upset. President Hassan Rouhani criticized those sanctions, and he called the White House, quote, mentally retarded.
So that is how low the dialogue between these two countries has gotten. A spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry described the consequences of the sanctions as a, quote, permanent closure of the path of diplomacy. This, of course, comes as the Trump administration figures out how to respond to Iran's downing of a U.S. drone. The Trump administration has called on U.S. allies to help in the Persian Gulf by protecting Persian Gulf shipping lanes, which is not far from the Gulf of Oman, where that drone went down. President Trump still says military action against Iran is an option.
I think a lot of restraint has been shown by us, a lot of restraint, and that doesn't mean we're going to show it in the future.
NPR's Tom Bowman has been watching all of this. He covers the Pentagon. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Noel.
Okay, so the administration says it wants an international coalition in the Persian Gulf. What would that look like? What would its mission be?
Well, first of all, we don't know what the international coalition would look like or exactly what its mission would be, other than it's called a maritime security mission. Some are using the word sentinel for this, and it could take several forms. You could have ships actually escort oil tankers and container ships as they're heading through the Strait of Hormuz, or you could just have Navy ships in the area kind of keeping an eye on things. And there are already a few U.S. ships in the area, as well as drones, of course, similar to the ones shot down by the Iranians. And there are also surveillance planes there right now as well. So very much a work in progress at this point.
But the point of this would be that the U.S. is not going it alone. Have any other countries signed on to this agreement or suggested that they think it's a good idea?
They haven't signed on to it yet. Some countries saying, of course, it's a good idea to protect shipping going through the Strait of Hormuz, where about 20% of the world's trade goes through. But Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in the Middle East trying to get some support from several countries for this effort. And also Acting Defense Secretary Mike Esper is heading to NATO this week. And clearly that maritime security mission will come up in his meetings with the NATO countries. But again, no firm commitments from any country at this point. But they do, officials say, expect some countries to sign up.
If they did, this would be a pretty interesting international effort. Is there any precedent for this? Like, has the U.S. done something like this before in the Gulf?
They have. 4 years ago, U.S. Navy took part in accompanying U.S. and British flagged ships after Iran seized the crew of a tanker ship flagged under the Marshall Islands. This had to do with, of all things, a financial dispute. And that escort effort accompanying effort lasted about a little over a week. And then, Noel, there was something called Operation Earnest Will back in the 1980s. That lasted about a year. And that was part of an effort, the American military, to protect Kuwaiti-owned tankers from Iranian attacks. And that was all wrapped up in what was called the Tanker Wars during the Iran-Iraq War. And interestingly, that was the largest naval convoy operation since World War II.
Wow.
However, we're not looking at anything at all like that.
Okay, NPR's Tom Bowman. Tom, thanks so much.
You're welcome, Noelle.
All right, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol has moved more than 300 immigrant children from a holding facility in Texas.
Yeah, this comes after a team of immigration lawyers paid a visit to that facility. And when they were there, they saw kids living in just squalid conditions. They were severely neglected. Some of them were severely ill. And according to multiple eyewitness accounts, these kids were just warehoused together. No basic hygiene, inadequate food, and little adult supervision. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar told reporters at the White House yesterday that detention facilities for children are at maximum capacity.
We are full right now. We are full. We do not have capacity for more of these unaccompanied children who come across the border. And that what happens is they get backed up there at the Department of Homeland Security's facilities because I can't put someone in a bed that does not exist in our shelters.
NPR's John Burnett covers immigration, and he's on the line from Austin. Hey, John.
Good morning.
So Rachel described some of the conditions that these kids were living in. I know that you've been reporting this out extensively. What did it look like in these holding facilities?
Well, I spoke to one of the attorneys, and just imagine what a drunk tank in a city jail might look like. Chain link walls, concrete floor, benches, no cots, open toilets. And this is how they found 350 children from ages 17 down to infants who can't walk. They were inside holding cells in a Border Patrol station in the little town of Clint, just outside of El Paso. 350 kids in a space with a capacity for 104. Kids sleeping on concrete floors, no soap, no showers. Some had the flu. Some of the children as young as 8 years old were trying to care for little babies. One of those visiting attorneys who sounded the alarm is Elora Mukherjee. She spoke to NPR's Ari Shapiro yesterday.
We interviewed many children who said that they were hungry, they were obviously dirty, they were sick, they were scared, and they'd been detained by Customs and Border Patrol for weeks on end, some for nearly a month.
For weeks on end, some for nearly a month. I mean, John, the law says these kids aren't supposed to be detained for longer than 72 hours. What's going on?
Right. Well, the Border Patrol said what they've been saying for months, that they operate short-term holding facilities designed for grown-ups and not for vulnerable populations of children. And we heard the Secretary of HHS at the top of the piece saying, we don't have room for them, so we can't accept these kids in some cases. And the lawyers who visited Clint said the maddening thing is these children had been classified as unaccompanied minors, yet many crossed the border with a family member, such as an aunt or an older sibling. And so they say these kids should have been allowed to stay with their relatives, but federal agents separate kids from any adults who are not their immediate parents or legal guardians.
All right, so the good news, I suppose, is that these kids have been moved from this very squalid facility. What happens to them now? Where are they going?
Well, Veronica Escobar, she's the El Paso Democrat who has the district where the Border Patrol station is located, says most of the kids have been relocated to other facilities in the region, and eventually they'll be transferred to child shelters, and most will be reunited with family here in the U.S. while they await a court date. And understandably, there's been an outcry, not just from Democrats. Vice President Mike Pence called the conditions totally unacceptable, and really all eyes are on Congress now. They're expected to vote this week on a $4.5 billion supplemental funding bill. It's supposed to help the whole government deal with this wave of migrants.
Okay, so we shall wait on Congress. NPR's John Burnett. Thanks so much, John.
It's a pleasure.
In Oklahoma, feuding state officials have finally struck an agreement on how to spend $85 million to fight the opioid epidemic there.
Yeah, last month, the drug company Teva Pharmaceuticals paid the multi-million-dollar settlement to the state for its role in the opioid crisis. Drug companies have so far this year settled claims worth more than $500 million, and the payouts are expected to grow fast. So all eyes are on Oklahoma to see how it's going to handle this money.
Brian Mann of North Country Public Radio covers opioid litigation for NPR. Hey, Brian.
Hey, how you doing?
So I'm well, thanks. This Oklahoma case was a big one. A lot of money paid out, $85 million. Remind us how we got here.
Yeah, there are hundreds of these lawsuits against big drug companies all over the U.S. claiming they fueled the addiction crisis by aggressively marketing addictive opioid medications. So last month, Teva Pharmaceuticals agreed to settle with the state of Oklahoma for $85 million, but politicians were starting to lawyer up, fighting over exactly how all that money will be spent.
Right. You had lawmakers, you had the state attorney general get involved, you had others get involved. Why are they fighting? Doesn't everybody agree there's an addiction crisis here?
Yeah, but money makes people kind of crazy. People don't agree what to do with the cash once it's in hand. A couple months ago, Oklahoma's Attorney General Mike Hunter did something that made people really mad. He cut a deal with another company, Purdue Pharma, for $270 million. Then he decided unilaterally how all that money would be spent. He decided most of it would go toward a new opioid research center, not to treating people who are suffering from addiction. He acknowledged in a speech that he faced a lot of anger from Oklahoma's legislature.
Rose petals were not strewn in my path. There was great consternation over me going around the appropriations process.
Hunter was speaking there to a group called the Bipartisan Policy Council in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so he decides it's going to go to an opioid research center. Other people are saying, no, it should go to treating people suffering from addiction. And then yesterday, this fight comes to a head in a courtroom in Oklahoma. What happened there?
So all these politicians, the governor, lawmakers in the legislature, the attorney general, cut a deal where the cash will now go into a fund that Oklahoma's legislature will get to spend. A judge signed off on that agreement. After the lawyers are paid, all the money has to be used for programs related to the opioid epidemic. It cannot be diverted to other projects.
I mean, one of the really interesting things here, Brian, is that this is happening across the country. These lawsuits are happening across the country. So this is not just a problem for Oklahoma.
Yeah, this is why people are watching Oklahoma so closely. There are literally thousands of cities, counties, state governments, tribal governments across the country, all of them saying they've been harmed by the drug industry. They're eager to get a big slice of this money. And people think Big Pharma could end up paying settlements and penalties on the scale of tens of billions of dollars.
Wow.
And remember, a lot of these communities are desperate. They're coping with a wave of people in their towns and villages who are opioid dependent, really ill, needing help for everything from rehab to housing to foster care. So as this money comes in, we could see governments starting to sue each other, fighting over where it will go. And that's what almost happened in Oklahoma.
Brian Mann of North Country Public Radio is covering the opioid epidemic for NPR. Brian, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Many years ago, a government spokesman, in a moment of candor, drew a distinction for me. He said to me, "I did not answer your question. I gave you my response."
That kind of distinction might be on Robert Mueller's mind. He's agreed to face questions before 2 House committees, but now he has to decide what questions he's really willing to answer. After he presented his report on Russian interference, Mueller appealed not to go before Congress at all.
I do not believe it is appropriate for me to speak further about the investigation or to comment on the actions of the Justice Department or Congress.
Now, that didn't stop Democrats from issuing a subpoena, which has led to his scheduled testimony on July 17th.
NPR's Ryan Lucas has covered the Mueller probe from the start and is in our studios once again. Ryan, good morning.
Good morning.
I imagine Democrats have plenty of questions they would like to add. They'd like to throw at Robert Mueller.
Absolutely. The question, I suppose, though, is, what can we expect to learn from this? And that's not entirely clear. Mueller is, of course, a man known for his by-the-book approach, plays by the rules, not someone who wants to be in the middle of a political fight. Said as much in May. He said he didn't want to testify. He also said that anything he did say wouldn't go beyond the information in the report. Negotiations between House Democrats and Mueller to get him up on the Hill to speak publicly about this took a very long time. Mueller's reluctance and even possible reticence hangs over all of this. But here's how House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler explained the Democrats' task last night on CNN.
I think he'll answer the questions, and it's up to us to ask questions that'll elicit the information.
Now, Democrats have talked about wanting to get Mueller to speak about matters that are outside the 4 corners of the report. But as Nadler just said, they have to ask the right questions to get there.
Suppose they don't get anything outside the 4 corners of the report. Is this still a worthwhile exercise from the Democrats' perspective?
From the Democrats' perspective, absolutely. This is a big deal for them. This gives them what they've wanted, a blockbuster set of hearing broadcast. Of course, we can expect live on national radio and live on national TV.
I can think of a network that people could tune into. Right. But anyway, go on.
This could help Democrats build a case against Trump. Some Democrats talk impeachment. Others feel that this may be a way to hamper his chances in 2020. Remember, Democrats have struggled to get anywhere on this so far. Investigations on the Hill have been stymied by the White House. President has blocked key witnesses from testifying. Democrats want to get Mueller up in public, in front of a national TV audience, even if he doesn't say anything outside the four corners of the report. Having him speak publicly can grab the American public's attention in a way that his 448-page report perhaps did not.
What do Republicans on these House committees make of all this?
Some Republicans who are ardent allies of the president on Capitol Hill are likely to use this as a way to chip away at the investigation. There are a lot of concerns that have raised over the past 2 years about how the investigation was conducted. They have raised allegations of potential or surveillance abuses by the FBI and the Justice Department. The top Republican on the House Judiciary Committee, Doug Collins, said that he hopes that this hearing, as he put it, will give Democrats closure.
Okay. Any response from the White House?
The president took to Twitter, tweeted overnight, presidential harassment. That's how he put it. That has been his line for quite some time. One of the president's private attorneys, Jay Sekulow, told our colleague Tamara Keith that he's not concerned. Mueller said he'll stick to the report, and they feel that the report helps them.
Ryan will be listening for your reporting on the report and the testimony about the report. NPR's Ryan Lucas, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Horrifying conditions reported for migrant children have heightened the sense of crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border.
Yeah, immigration attorney Taylor Levy has been talking to clients who spent time in U.S. custody.
I have worked with asylum seekers for 10 years. I have never seen people as scared, as just like viscerally terrified while they're begging me, please don't let me get sent back. Please don't let me get sent back.
Now, after intense criticism, the head of Customs and Border Protection has resigned. And then last night, the House passed border legislation that would address some parts of this crisis.
NPR's John Burnett has covered the border for many years. He's in Texas this morning. John, hi.
Morning, Steve.
What kinds of conditions are we learning about for migrant children?
Well, there's been quite a bit of drama in the last 48 hours surrounding the fate of those 350 children who were being held in cells with room for 100 at a Border Patrol station in West Texas. By now, we've all heard about the conditions. The children told lawyer advocates who visited them they weren't getting enough to eat, they were filthy and inconsolably sad, and the older kids were taking care of the tiny ones. Yesterday, there was some movement. 249 of the kids were transferred from the Clint Border Patrol station to the custody of Health and Human Services. There, they'll live in youth shelters that are a giant improvement over Border Patrol cells. But a senior CBP official told reporters yesterday that 100 of them will stay at Clint because there's simply nowhere else to put them. The whole immigration detention system is maxed out by this historic surge of families and children crossing the border seeking asylum. Now the action shifts to Washington. As you said, Congress is debating that $4.5 billion aid package that would provide for more humane treatment of migrants at the border. And the House passed it last night. Now it goes to the Senate.
John, I got to tell you, regardless of anybody's views on immigration policy, when you describe the conditions for children, it's hard to listen to. It's hard to take. And now we have the resignation of John Sanders, acting head of the CBP. Why did he quit?
Right. Sanders sent out a message to his agency yesterday, but he didn't give a reason for leaving. There are two theories among border bureaucracy watchers. One is that he wasn't enough of a pit bull. Trump likes firebrands leading his immigration agencies. Sanders is known as a competent, dedicated, somewhat mild-mannered policy guy.
Is that anything you would say about Mark Morgan, his acting replacement?
Well, there are multiple reports out there that Sanders' replacement at CBP will be Mark Morgan, but there's been no official announcement. He's had an unlikely trajectory. Morgan was head of the Border Patrol at the end of the Obama administration. He was not popular in the ranks. He was the first head of the agency who'd never been a border agent wearing the distinctive green uniform. One agent told me, "We bleed green," and Morgan didn't fit in. And Trump fired him as soon as he took office. But after that, Morgan sort of reinvented himself as a conservative commentator on Fox, saying things like this to host Tucker Carlson about unaccompanied migrant children.
I've been in the detention facilities where I've walked up these individuals that are so-called minors, 17 or under, and I've looked at them and I've looked at their eyes, Tucker, and I said, that is a soon-to-be MS-13 gang member. It's unequivocal.
So Trump brought on Morgan a little over 2 months ago as acting head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So now the head of every immigration agency is acting and unconfirmed by the Senate, including an acting secretary over Homeland Security. Representative Benny Thompson, the Democratic chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, described DHS as chaos.
Really appreciate the clarification that we don't know for sure that Morgan is moving into this new job, because the president has sometimes talked about a replacement or even announced a replacement for various jobs, and then that person doesn't end up in the position. John, thanks so much.
You bet, Steve.
That's NPR's John Burnett. Okay, tonight, 10 Democratic presidential hopefuls take the stage in Miami, Florida.
That's right. It's the first of two primetime debates that are going to air on NBC, and tonight's lineup includes
Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Bill de Blasio, John Delaney, Tulsi Gabbard, Jay Inslee, Amy Klobuchar, Beto O'Rourke, Tim Ryan, Elizabeth Warren.
And then tomorrow, another debate, another 10 Democrats.
Shouldn't Brian Williams have gotten a little more announcer? Beto O'Rourke! Oh, he did. Okay,
For a lot of people watching who are not like us, it will be their first time really seeing some of these candidates.
NPR's lead political editor, Domenico Montanaro, will be watching and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
So what key questions do Democrats need to answer before this national audience?
Well, the thing that we keep hearing about on the campaign trail, and, we've talked about this plenty on the air and what we've seen in polling, is that electability is number one with Democratic voters by far this year. I mean, sure, they're going to be asked about policy. They have to speak to immigration, like we've been talking about, healthcare, climate change, student loan debt, income inequality. But these debates are really the first chance for millions of voters across the country to look on that stage and see who they think up there is a president.
It's interesting that most of the leading candidates, according to the early polls, aren't on until the second night. And so I guess this first night is an opportunity for people to look at the other ones they haven't really heard much about yet.
Well, I mean, I'd say that Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Beto O'Rourke are three people who have been leading in the polls. If you go by that, that they're fairly big names. But everybody, you're right, wanted to be on stage with Joe Biden because he's been, the so-called front runner for so long in this race since he's gotten in. And because so many of them are making cases against him because they have a fundamental different view on how the country should be governed. But tonight is an opportunity. I mean, for a lot of these candidates, for some of the ones you mentioned, especially Elizabeth Warren, to stand out on their own. I mean, Warren has hustled. She's been substantive and has started to pass by Bernie Sanders in a lot of polls. So, for tomorrow night, as Sanders is looking to square off against Biden, Warren is really somebody he's got a lot to worry about with. And, she is going to try to command that stage tonight.
Do you have the impression that Democratic voters are being given a truly wide range of choices here, or is it more a difference in tone? Joe Biden has tried to seem a little more congenial, a little more moderate, perhaps, than some of the other candidates, and yet also insists no one should question my progressive credentials. Are they standing for fundamentally different approaches to the country, fundamentally different challenges to the president?
Yeah, I mean, one of the frames in this, in this campaign so far has been this progressive versus pragmatic approach. In this Democratic primary, they're going to have to try to go after people who are going to get them the nomination first, but they also can't really alienate the middle. And we're so polarized, it's highly unlikely that, of course, many Trump voters would be open to voting for any of these candidates. But striking that balance is really difficult and a thing that is important to do when you have this talk of unity versus, the more progressive approach.
Domenico, thanks as always.
You're so welcome.
NPR's Domenico Montanaro.
This morning, we are halfway through the first primary debate between Democrats who hope to unseat President Trump in 2020.
Yeah, the first 10 candidates who took stage on the first night showed some differences with each other and with the president, of course. It is a chance just to get used to the voices of Washington Governor Jay Inslee and Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard and former Housing Secretary Julian Castro.
The biggest threat to the security of the United States is Donald Trump.
He needs to get back into the Iran nuclear deal and swallow his pride, put the American people first.
On January 20th, 2021, we'll say adios to Donald Trump.
So the Democrats would like, although Democratic voters face big choices about who they think can win and also which policies they would favor.
All right, NPR's Scott Detrow is in Miami covering the debates. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning.
So the big question going into this debate was, would any of these candidates have one of those special breakout moments? Did any of them?
I don't think there was one clear-cut star of the night. We had expected Elizabeth Warren to really dominate the conversation all night, and that didn't quite happen. A few names that I think really did jump out a little bit, though. Julian Castro, he has not gotten a ton of attention, but he talked a lot about immigration, a lot about social justice issues, and he was in the middle of a lot of the bigger exchanges of the night. Flip side, Beto O'Rourke, I think, was one of those candidates who really needed a big night to get some momentum back, and that did not quite happen. Cory Booker, similar situation. He got the most airtime and questions. He was one of the most talked about candidates on Twitter, and he was the most Googled. So on the things we've got some data for, Cory Booker had a good night.
Okay, so these early debates are meant to get voters familiar with where the candidates stand on the issues. What were the big issues last night?
Yeah, this is a real clear illustration of how much the campaign has been a real race to the left. Who can be the most progressive candidate? One key moment, health care. One of the few issues where Elizabeth Warren is not the one setting the progressive standard for the field. She wants Medicare for all, but not that right off the bat elimination of private health insurance. So one of the moderators asked, show of hands, who would get rid of private health insurance? It was really notable. Elizabeth Warren's hand shot straight up.
Medicare for all solves that problem. And I understand there are a lot of politicians who say, oh, it's just not possible. We just can't do it. Have a lot of political reasons for this. What they're really telling you is they just won't fight for it.
Immigration, another big issue where candidates tack to the left. A lot of talk about what's happening at the border right now, how they would stop President Trump's policies. Also, a heated moment between Castro and O'Rourke on the idea of decriminalizing border crossings.
Then I want to make sure that you're treated with respect.
I'm still talking about everybody else.
But you're looking at just one small part of this. I'm talking about a comprehensive rewrite of our immigration laws.
That's not true.
And if we do
So, broadly speaking, this was a question of whether to treat illegal crossings as a criminal charge as it currently stands or a civil penalty. Castro wants to make that shift, and O'Rourke does not.
And Castro, what I thought was so interesting, Castro was talking in specifics about Section 1325, which is a thing that makes it criminal. But I thought most people don't know what 1325 is, but maybe that was Castro's point. Let's have him figure out. All right, so tonight is round two. What are you looking for tonight, Scott?
A lot of the bigger names are on stage, mostly former Vice President Joe Biden. Of the top 5 polling candidates in the race, only Elizabeth Warren was on the stage last night. So I'm interested to see how the dynamic is between all of them, particularly between Biden and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who have both really been criticizing each other's worldview lately.
NPR's Scott Detrow. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
There is a U.S. government program that protects some undocumented people from being deported. Now that program may be on its way out.
And immigration advocates are warning that it could create chaos for many people in the military. This program aims to ensure that if an American is on active duty in the U.S. military, they don't have to be distracted by news that one of their family members is being deported. The Trump administration may be scaling back those protections.
We are learning about this through exclusive reporting from Franco Ordonez. He covers the White House for NPR. He's in studio. Good morning, Franco.
Good morning.
All right, so I imagine a lot of our listeners just won't know what this program is. Can you describe it?
Yeah, it's a program called Parole in Place. It is essentially a temporary protection for immigrant families of those who are in the active duty in the military. As Steve pointed out, if someone is fighting overseas, say in Afghanistan, you really don't want them distracted. You don't want them worried about a spouse in the United States being deported. It only applies to certain cases, those who arrived illegally and you cannot change your status. If you overstay a visa, for example, you can't. This does not apply. It actually started under George W. Bush, and it was just an idea to make it a little bit easier for these troops fighting overseas.
So are these protections going to go away altogether? And I guess a very important question For people who have already got the protection, the parole in place, are they grandfathered in?
Well, we don't know exactly how far they're going to go back. I'm told they're going to be scaled back. The lawyers who have worked with these active duty family members have been told that it will be scaled back. Being terminated is a term that's been reported to me, but that may still be provided under very rare cases. As to the point of whether it will be grandfathered, that is still an open question. It is definitely a concern of these families, but the expectation is at least those who will get it will still be able to keep it. That is why so many of these lawyers are racing to get it in before it is terminated.
And I feel obliged to just point out, this is not a program that probably affects nobody, right? Because there are a lot of immigrants who end up serving in the military, or children of immigrants who end up serving in the United States military. New citizens in this country protect the country, and they're in immigrant communities where they may well be connected to somebody who's not properly documented.
No doubt, immigration has been part of the military basically since day one. They are weaved into the fabric. As you know, the United States recruits immigrants. They recruit spouses of immigrants. They recruit the children of immigrants. Nearly 130,000 immigrants have been naturalized from over 30 foreign countries, actually since October 1st, 2001.
Often want the language specialties and other kinds of knowledge.
Absolutely.
So based on your reporting, what do we know about when this program could actually be withdrawn? Do we have any clue?
So what we're told is that they're hearing that it could be terminated as early as next month. That's why I mentioned that there is a race from lawyers to get their applications to get done. I will say that word really is just starting to get out in the immigration lawyer community, and really there is a race to get this happen so that their clients can be protected.
You're going to keep covering this one?
Absolutely.
NPR's Franco Ordonez, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, today we are expecting rulings from the Supreme Court on two major issues.
And these are the two questions. Can politicians draw legislative district maps to benefit their own party? And also, can the government ask who is a citizen on the next census? A lot of political sensitivities here. The Trump administration added a citizenship question to the 2020 census, and a number of lower courts ruled against it. And then on gerrymandering, justices decide two cases, one in a Democratic Maryland district and another in a Republican district in North Carolina.
NPR senior editor Ron Elving is watching the court closely. Hey, Ron.
Good morning.
All right, let's start with the gerrymandering cases first. This is always such a complex issue. What might potential decisions by the court mean for political redistricting and for people who are voting?
If the court upholds the practice of partisan gerrymandering you described, which allows a ruling party to dominate out of proportion to its vote share in a state, then voters shouldn't expect to see any changes at all. Just more of the same partisan map-making that protects incumbents and preserves the existing power arrangements in each state. But if the court decides to end its long-standing tolerance for this sort of thing, put limits on it, voters in Maryland might well see another seat or two suddenly become competitive for Republicans, and voters in North Carolina might see as many as half the seats become competitive for Democrats. And voters in other states might see the next round of redistricting after 2020 conducted on a more even-handed basis.
So potentially some big cases or some big changes coming, depending on how these cases are decided. Ron, the other big issue is whether the United States Census can ask people about their citizenship status. Advocates for immigrants' rights have recently been pushing for the Supreme Court to delay its decision until the fall, even though the census is approaching quickly. What is the argument for a delay here?
New and rather remarkable evidence has surfaced that casts doubt on the rationale for adding this question. The evidence emerged from the laptop of a political consultant who is now deceased, and it indicates that the citizenship question did not have its origin in a request from the Justice Department, as we were told, that it was not about enforcing voting rights laws, as we were told, but that question was added by Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, and it was added as part of a strategy to restrict the count of Hispanics in 2020 and other immigrants as well, and restrain the influence of Hispanics in American politics in general. So immigration advocates would like to see this case go back to lower courts for reconsideration in the light of this evidence before the Supreme Court weighs in.
Once these rulings come down today, the Supreme Court will have decided about 24 cases in the past 2 weeks. What do their recent decisions tell us about this Supreme Court?
Mostly that the conservatives are in control, and they usually prevail. But Chief Justice Roberts has taken a couple of opportunities to cross the aisle, as it were, to listen to the arguments from the other side, most especially from Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Elena Kagan in most recent days. We'll see how far that willingness goes in the rulings later today and in the years ahead.
NPR's Ron Elving reporting on two important decisions by the Supreme Court that are expected to come down today. Ron, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Joe Biden has been the clear frontrunner in the Democratic field since even before he got into the presidential race. So if there was any fire on the debate stage last night, it was probably going to come in the form of an attack on him. And it did.
Yes, it did. It came from all directions, but Senator Kamala Harris of California made the sharpest dig at Biden. She challenged him over his recent comments about working through disagreements with the late Senators James Eastland and Herman Talmadge. Now, those two men supported segregation.
It was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country.
And the board, I did not praise racist. That is not true. Number one. Number two, if we want to have this campaign litigated on who supports civil rights and whether I did or not, I'm happy to do that.
NPR's national political correspondent Mara Liasson was there in Miami for the debate, and she joins us now. Mara, let's just start with that exchange between Harris and Biden. Lots of Americans watched the debate last night, but I'm guessing some didn't, including me. I was sleeping. So for us, can you explain what precipitated this?
Congratulations.
Right. What precipitated that moment?
Well, what struck me about that moment is one of the biggest questions in the Democratic race is the battle to emerge as the main challenger to Joe Biden. And last night, it turns out it was Kamala Harris, hands down. Biden's answer was defensive. You just heard him. And then he stopped mid-sentence as if he was watching the clock. Most candidates just keep talking and talking. And he said, quote, "My time is up," which, of course, a lot of people took as a metaphor for Joe Biden himself. So he comes out of that exchange a damaged frontrunner. How damaged isn't clear. Harris, on the other hand, dispelled some of the criticism of her, that she's too cautious, too vague, doesn't know where she stands on issues. And one of her goals last night was to help voters imagine her on the stage one-on-one with Donald Trump as the prosecutor she once was and as the impressive questioner that a lot of people have seen in Senate hearings. And she accomplished that, too.
Oh. All right, so that's kind of the style of last night. Let's get into some of the policy substance. Healthcare. This is something that came up in the first round of the Democratic debates on Wednesday. Senator Elizabeth Warren and New York Mayor Bill de Blasio both raised their hand when the moderators asked, hey, who among you is supportive of eliminating private insurance? Those two hands went up. Same question was put to the candidates last night. What happened?
Two hands went up again, Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris. And Bernie Sanders' plan for a mandatory Medicare for all, that is the elimination of private health insurance plans, really became a foil last night. A lot of other candidates pushed back against that. They said they were for a voluntary public option instead. And here's what Sanders said when he was pressed on whether middle-class people would have their taxes raised to pay for his plan.
No premiums, no deductibles, no co-payments, no out-of-pocket expenses. Yes, they will pay more in taxes, but less in health care for what they get.
So there you have it. But in one of the weirdest moments of last night, Harris, who also raised her hand at that, walked it back later, saying she didn't understand the question. She thought the question was, would you give up your own personal health insurance for a government plan? And this is exactly what happened with Harris earlier in the campaign, where she made a comment at a campaign forum that she would like to get rid of private insurance, and then walked it back later. She did herself a lot of good last night. She wasn't perfect.
Right. We don't, just in seconds remaining, Mara, immigration. What happened on immigration?
Immigration, all of the candidates agreed that illegal immigrants would get health care under a government plan if they were president.
Which then triggered a tweet from President Trump, who thought that might be a problem for Democrats in a general election. All right, Mara Liasson on the debates last night in Miami. We appreciate it. Okay, while immigration remains a top policy priority for U.S. politicians, we are learning more about how it's a matter of business for others.
That's right. Migrants coming into Mexico and the U.S. from Central America will often pay human smugglers to guide them on their way. Those smugglers are called coyotes, and some of them say business is booming.
Freelance journalist Emily Green recently traveled to Guatemala to report on this for Vice, and she joins us now from Matamoros, Mexico. She's on Skype with us this morning. Emily, I understand you got a chance to actually speak with a coyote on the border in Guatemala. What did you learn from that conversation?
Well, I just want to take a step back and say that big picture. I learned that way more people than you might think are involved in the smuggling business. It's not so hidden as I imagined. And I just want to give you an example. There's this one town in Guatemala where there's a loudspeaker that announces the news of the day. And part of the news of the day is, hey, for those of you who want to go north to the U.S., call this coyote. And here's his telephone number. So I asked a friend of mine to call and inquire about prices. And I want to play you a little bit of that tape.
Yeah.
¿Cómo es el viaje, señora? Quiero saber más o menos cómo es el viaje. ¿Cómo me llevan en camión? ¿Me llevan escondido?
Así se viajan así por bus.
En bus me llevan.
Sí, en bus lo viajan.
What are they saying there?
So right there, my friend, the customer, says, "How's the trip? Do you take me in trucks? Am I hidden?" And the person on the other end says, "No, you travel in bus." And then my friend, the customer, says, "I don't have to walk." And the coyote says, "No. Why would you walk? Here in Mexico, you go in bus. If you want to go illegally as a wetback, though, you walk for 4 or 5 days in the desert."
Did this person use that phrase?
Yes, that was so crazy.
Wow.
They literally used the phrase for wetback.
Wow, which is obviously very derogatory. So you spent a lot of time with this coyote you called Daniel. What did he tell you?
So I think one of the main things he told me was a confirmation of what we already know, that there's a big market for parents going with their children. He says in the past year, roughly 90 to 95% of his customers are parents with children, and that's a change from years past. And it's created a feedback cycle. So what's happening now in Guatemala is that everybody seems to know somebody who's arrived to the U.S., and so they say, I'm going to follow suit and do the same. Also, I would say that Trump's rhetoric has been very good for business because every time Trump threatens to close the border or deport people, Daniel uses it as a marketing tool. And he tells people, go now before it's too late.
Which is fascinating because that's the exact opposite effect of what the administration would like to happen. They're making these threats to deter illegal immigration. And you're saying it's actually the reason it's going up because people think that they got to get it while the getting's good.
I would say that Trump, in a weird way, is his own worst enemy.
Emily Green for us on the U.S.-Mexico border. Emily, we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
President Donald Trump is in Osaka, Japan, meeting with leaders from the world's biggest economies.
That's right. The G20 summit is underway. And before things even got started, President Trump began criticizing some of America's closest allies over international security, trade, some other things. But he did not criticize Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Now, this was the first time that Putin and Trump met face-to-face since the release of the Mueller report, which, of course, confirmed that Russia interfered in the 2016 U.S. election.
Michael Sullivan is in Osaka covering the summit and joins us now on Skype. Hey, Michael.
Hi.
So, this meeting between Trump and President Putin, as Noel notes, the first meeting of these two leaders since the release of the Mueller report. Did election interference come up?
It did, Rachel, but not in reference to the last election, but the next one. Trump started by saying it was an honor to be meeting with Putin again. Said the two men had many things to discuss, including trade and disarmament. Then a reporter asked the president if he would tell Putin not to meddle in the 2020 election. Trump said, yes, of course I will. And then he turned to Putin and said, no meddling in the election. And then he wagged his finger at Putin in a kind of playful way as he repeated it. And that was pretty much it.
So was
no
it
mention of the Mueller report.
Right. Was it tongue in cheek? I guess it's hard to tell.
It looked a little tongue in cheek. Yes.
So what about Iran? I mean, several G20 nations are still in the Iran nuclear deal. Their President Trump is at the G20. They see the threat from Iran very differently than President Trump does. Is he talking about Iran at the summit?
He did. He was asked about it at his bilateral meeting with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the president said his message for Iran is the same one he's been repeating for the past 3 days.
We have a lot of time. There's no rush. They can take their time. There's absolutely no time pressure. I think that in the end, hopefully it's going to work out. If it does, great. And if it doesn't, you'll be hearing about it.
So, I mean, as we've noted, President Trump isn't a big fan of multilateral gatherings in general, and isn't afraid to kind of lambaste allies who are sitting right in front of him, although clearly he chose not to do that with Vladimir Putin. What's been his tone when it comes to talking about and with allies?
He's been very restrained today in his meetings with both Prime Minister Abe and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Trump had been complaining the past few days about Japan not pulling its weight in the U.S.-Japan military alliance, and he'd been threatening Japan with increased tariffs on Japanese auto exports to the U.S. But today he had nothing but praise for Abe and said he appreciated the fact Japanese automakers and other companies are increasing their presence in the U.S. and adding jobs. Before the trip, Trump also blasted India for imposing tariffs on U.S. goods this month. But today, and it was all love as he met with India's Modi. He congratulated him on his recent election victory and said the relationship between the two countries has never been better. In a statement, the White House said a close partnership between the U.S. and India is central to global peace and stability. And as if to underscore that statement, there was a three-way meeting.
We got to leave it there. NPR's Michael Sullivan